Welcome to this deep dive. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you won't miss any of our great content. Okay, so let's get right into it. Today we're diving into a set of sources that really tries to strip away all the window dressing of politics.
It really does. It kind of throws out all the labels we're used to.
Right. The claim is that whether you are running a charity, a huge corporation, a tiny American town, or, a massive totalitarian state, the rules for survival are fundamentally the same.
Exactly. And that's a pretty big claim.
It is. So the mission for us today is to really unpack these iron rules.
Mhm.
It's a theory that basically says politics isn't complicated at all. It's simply the universal and often pretty brutal pursuit of self-interest.
That's right. I mean, for centuries, we've talked about political systems as if they're fundamentally different. Democracies are driven by high-minded ideals, and dictatorships are driven by, what, madness or pure malice?
Yeah, good versus evil, basically.
But this framework says, hang on, let's put aside all those moral labels. Let's just look at political leaders as rational, self-interested actors.
Rational being the key word there.
The most important word. Their choices are dictated entirely by the structure of their organization, not by their personality or their ideology.
So the sources are saying that if you just look at the outcomes, why certain countries are rich, why others are just trapped in poverty, why some leaders can hold onto power for decades while others are gone in a flash, the answer isn't culture.
Right, it's not geography, it's not even ideology, really. It all comes down to structural incentives, the rules of the game.
And once you accept that unifying logic, it immediately starts to raise some pretty surprising questions, things that conventional political science has a hard time explaining.
A very hard time. For instance, if democracy is truly the best system, why is the tenure of even very successful democratic leaders so brief? I mean, you can lead your nation to victory in a world war, save civilization,
Okay.
and then a few months later, you're out of a job.
It seems completely illogical. And then you have the flip side of that coin. Why do countries with just deeply misguided, corruption-riddled economic policies, why do they manage to survive for decades?
And not just survive, but often while, actively oppressing their own citizens, the whole system looks completely unsustainable from the outside, but it just keeps going.
It persists.
Precisely. Or take the phenomenon that economists call the resource curse. Why are lands that are just blessed with vast natural resources, oil, diamonds, you name it, so often plagued by extreme poverty, by conflict, by totalitarianism? It's completely counterintuitive.
You'd think that wealth would lead to prosperity for everyone, but it almost never does.
And it's not just about nations. The sources say you can apply this exact same logic to, say, a corporate boardroom.
How so?
Well, why are failed CEOs, people who demonstrably shrink shareholder value, who run the company into the ground, why are they so often retained and paid these handsome sums?
The golden parachutes.
Exactly. Why do they get a golden parachute when the rest of the company is basically sinking? It doesn't seem to make any sense.
So the common thread, according to these sources, is that all these systems are governed by the exact same underlying calculus.
You have to discard the idea of civic virtue or, political cytopathology. The system doesn't care if the leader is a saint or a monster. The leader will always, always choose the action that maximizes their probability of staying in power.
It's pure survival.
Pure political survival. And the core principle of this whole framework is that all governments, all organizations, they only differ along three crucial dimensions. Just three.
And these three dimensions are the key variables. They dictate every single choice a leader makes, from how they tax people to whether they go to war to whether they invest in public health.
And to really get our heads around this, we have to see it in action. Because the really wild idea here is that the rules that dictate political survival in, say, Beijing or Riyadh are the exact same rules that dictated survival in a tiny, obscure American city, a place called Bell, California.
And that's the perfect illustration, isn't it? That it doesn't matter if you rule a small town or command a global power. The incentives are perfectly aligned. So here's where it gets really, really interesting. Let's go back to 2010. The place is Bell, California. It's a small working-class town. For 17 years, a man named Robert Rizzo was the city manager.
And by all public accounts, he was doing a great job. He was lauded by the city council. They said he took Bell from the brink of bankruptcy to having, 15 straight years of balanced budgets.
A model of fiscal discipline. That's what he looked like on the surface.
But that whole success story just crumbled when a couple reporters started digging and uncovered the staggering numbers attached to Rizzo's tenure.
Get this. His compensation package was nearly $800,000 a year.
Which is just an insane number. At the time, the President of the United States was making $400,000. The governor of California, a state with tens of millions of people, was making just over $200,000.
The Rizzo salary wasn't just high, it was obscene for a city of 35,000 people.
The initial reaction from everyone was, well, this must be outright theft. He must be illegally diverting funds from the city treasury into his own pocket.
But what the state attorney general at the time, Jerry Brown, soon discovered was something far more insidious. And critically, a lot of what he was doing was technically legal.
It was legal corruption, which is the most effective kind. See, Bell's city council had deliberately set the property tax rate about 50% higher than all the nearby communities.
50%? That's a huge difference.
A massive difference. And this incredibly high tax rate allowed Rizzo and the council members to balance the budget, which, satisfied that one technical requirement of governance.
Checking the box.
While using the immense surplus cash to enrich themselves and their key cronies. So this wasn't simple theft. It was a systematic transfer of public wealth into private hands, all facilitated by high taxes and very low public scrutiny.
The puzzle for me is still, how did they get away with this for 17 years? How did they make sure the voters, the actual people paying those insane property taxes, didn't just throw them all out of office?
Well, to understand that, we have to identify the actual political coalition in Bell. And the key thing to realize is that it was tiny.
How tiny?
Bell had about 9,400 registered voters. In the contested 2009 election, the turnout was only 2,285 people. That's roughly 24% of the electorate.
Which is already pretty low.
Very low. But here is the critical data point. The city council election was decided by plurality. The two winners just needed one more vote than the person who came in third.
Okay, so the actual winning support, the number of votes they really needed, was tiny.
It was minuscule. The election was effectively achieved with supportive votes from only about 13% of the registered electorate, a tiny fraction of the total.
So Rizzo served at the pleasure of the city council, a group of 5 people. They were his essential supporters.
They were his entire world. To keep their loyalty and, crucially, to maintain his own massive pension, which was estimated to be somewhere between $650,000 and $880,000 a year, Rizzo had to make sure the council members received extravagant private rewards.
In this case, their enormous salaries, their own pensions, and all the other perks.
He guaranteed their personal wealth, and in return, they guaranteed him his job security and his ability to just keep the whole cycle going.
The system was perfectly functional, but only for them.
Perfectly functional for the political survival of the council and Rizzo. If the citizens had been more informed, or if, say, the council had been subject to some kind of rigorous state compensation review, Rizzo could never have secured their loyalty. Secrecy and the relative apathy of the larger electorate were the key ingredients.
Yeah, so if we step back, the Bell case really just demonstrates this iron rule perfectly. When a leader's survival depends on a small coalition of backers, and those backers are drawn from a much larger pool of potential voters, the interchangeable masses.
Then providing lavish private rewards is the most efficient, the cheapest, and the most effective path to a long, long tenure.
Rizzo mastered this political game.
He absolutely did. And that masterclass takes us right into the formal theory that applies this exact logic to, well, to everything.
It's really amazing to think that the same cold calculus that kept Robert Rizzo in power in this little town is the same thing that determined the survival strategies of, say, Louis XIV or the leaders of the Soviet Union.
It is. And this is where we have to sort of reevaluate the insights of history's great political philosophers.
It forces you to distinguish between the ones who understood the real mechanics of power and the ones who were maybe, I don't know, a little blinded by their own hopes for benevolence.
I think that's a great way to put it. Take someone like Thomas Hobbes. He saw the ultimate power residing in the monarch, the Leviathan. But he made a huge assumption. He assumed that the absolute leader must necessarily be benevolent.
Why?
Because in his words, no king can be rich whose subjects are either poor. He thought the king's wealth depended on the people's wealth.
And Robert Rizzo just proves that completely wrong right out of the gate.
Immediately. Rizzo became immensely rich, while the citizens of Bell were demonstrably poorer, burdened by those punitive property taxes. Rizzo didn't need the masses to be prosperous at all. He only needed his tiny handful of essentials to be prosperous and loyal.
Okay, so Hobbes was wrong. Who got it right?
Machiavelli. Machiavelli had a far, far better grasp of political reality. He wasn't talking about ideals or what should be. He was talking about cold, hard political strategy.
What was his advice?
He advised that to establish power, A leader must strategically withdraw the boldest and most ambitious spirits from the population and make gentlemen of them by giving them castles and possessions, as well as money.
That is exactly what Rizzo was doing. He was making gentlemen of his 5 council members through money and inflated compensation.
Rizzo was Machiavelli's hired hand just half a millennium later. The playbook is identical.
And then you have someone like James Madison in the U.S. wrestling with the fears of concentrated power in Federalist 10.
Right. Madison was terrified of the tyranny of the majority in small republics. But he missed the critical structural distinction that this whole framework emphasizes.
Which is?
He failed to distinguish between how many people had a say in selecting leaders versus how many people were truly essential to keeping that leader in place. And as the source material stresses over and over, those two numbers can be drastically different.
And that very distinction is the absolute heart of what's called the Selectorate Theory.
It is. It simplifies politics by defining all organizations, not by abstract labels like democracy or dictatorship, but by the size and the relationship of these 3 organizational groups.
Okay, let's break them down. What's the first one?
The first is the nominal selectorate, which the sources sometimes call the interchangeables. This is the pool of every single potential supporter.
So in the U.S., that's basically all legal adults who can vote.
Exactly. And in a system like North Korea, it's technically all citizens who are eligible to vote for the supreme leader. They are the masses. They can theoretically be swapped out for others.
Okay, so that's the big pool. What's the next level down?
That's the real selectorate, or the influentials. These are the people whose support is truly influential in choosing a leader. They're the ones who actually have the institutional power to elevate someone or to remove them.
So in early U.S. history, that might have been the electors in the Electoral College, or in a one-party state, it would be the Communist Party faithful, maybe the key members of the Central Committee.
Precisely.
And then finally, the most critical group.
The winning coalition, or the essentials. These are the key supporters. The 5 council members in Bell, California. The small handful of top generals in a junta. The cabinet secretaries. These are the people without whose support the leader is completely finished.
And the crucial insight here, the big idea, is that governments don't really differ in kind. It's not democracy over here and dictatorship over there.
No, it's a continuous spectrum. And it's defined by the size of that winning coalition relative to the nominal selectorate, the big pool.
So when we use the label democracy, what we're really saying in this framework is that it's a system where the winning coalition is extremely large. It represents a huge proportion of the overall electorate.
That's it. The U.S. winning coalition size relative to the whole electorate is estimated to be one of the world's biggest proportions. It's often rated above 0.9 on the scale they use.
And what does that 0.9 scale measure?
It's the ratio of the essentials to the nominal selectorate. So a high number, like 0.9, means the leader has to satisfy almost everyone to stay in power.
Which forces the leader to invest in public goods, things like infrastructure, healthcare, rule of law. Because that's the only way you can possibly satisfy such a massive group of people. You can't just give them all cash.
It's too expensive. Private rewards are off the table.
So what's at the other end of that spectrum?
A dictatorship. It's characterized by having a particularly small number of essentials drawn from a very large pool of interchangeables. Think of countries like Zimbabwe or modern China. The leader can use the vast tax base, the interchangeables, to personally reward only a tiny handful of people.
And what about something like a monarchy or a military junta?
That's a bit different. A system like Saudi Arabia, or historically the Ottoman Empire, has small interchangeables, small influentials, and small essentials. The entire system is tightly controlled and small, which makes it structurally distinct from a large-scale dictatorship like China, which has a huge population to draw from.
But the fundamental logic is the same, and it's simple. The size of that winning coalition dictates the leader's entire incentive structure.
Small coalition. Use cheap, private rewards.
Yeah.
Large coalition. You have no choice but to invest expensively in public goods.
And that leads us directly into understanding the deep structure of these small coalitions and the really ruthless calculus of loyalty. Let's talk about the myth of absolute rule. When people think of historical autocracy, Louis XIV of France, the Sun King, he's often the main example. He reigned for over 70 years.
But the source material is adamant. No leader, no matter how powerful they seem, ever stands truly alone.
So even the Sun King had his essentials.
He absolutely did. And he faced a serious existential threat late in his career when France was effectively bankrupt from all his wars. His political survival was at grave risk.
But not from the starving peasants, right?
and never from the peasants. The risk was from the old guard aristocrats and the military generals who made up his essential support. They saw their own sources of wealth and privilege drying up, which made them perfectly willing to replace him.
So Louis's big political move wasn't about austerity or reform for the good of the country. It was about strategically manipulating his essential coalition.
Exactly. He executed this masterful political strategy. He started expanding opportunities to the noblesse de robe. This was the new aristocracy, often wealthy commoners who had literally bought their titles.
Ah, so he was creating a new pool of potential essentials.
By expanding that pool, he made the existing essentials replaceable. So if an old duke was getting a little uppity, Louis could just threaten to replace him with one of these hungry new loyalists who would do anything for a seat at the table.
And that risk of being substituted creates fierce, fierce loyalty.
The knowledge that there are 1,000 people waiting in the wings to take your place means you do whatever the boss demands. No questions asked.
And that highlights the core danger inside these small coalition systems. The leader has to consistently choose personal loyalty over technical competence.
In a small coalition, the greatest risk to the incumbent is not an outside threat. It's the person on the inside who is most capable of replacing them.
Wait, so you're telling me that deliberately selecting an incompetent loyalist is actually the rational political choice for an autocrat?
It's the optimal strategy for political survival, yes. If you are competent, you become a competitor. Look at Fidel Castro's purges after the 1959 revolution in Cuba.
What happened there?
Of the 21 ministers he appointed right after the revolution, 16 of them were removed or ousted within just 2 years. These were the very people who had fought and bled for the revolution.
They were the original heroes, the most competent people he had. But I guess they also demonstrated that they had the ability to overthrow a sitting government.
Which made them inherently dangerous to Castro, and that included someone as famous as Che Guevara. The sources suggest that Che's biggest problem wasn't some ideological deviation. It was simply that he was second in competence and stature only to Fidel himself.
A direct threat.
A direct threat. So Castro had him sent on an ultimately disastrous mission to Bolivia in 1965 and then strategically cut off his support, leaving him totally isolated to fight and eventually die.
It's truly brutal logic. Every essential member knows the stakes. There is a long line of hungry people behind you waiting for your spot.
Which forces extreme and unquestioning loyalty. And the leader, because they're only paying a handful of people, doesn't need to spend a huge proportion of the regime's total revenue on loyalty. They just need to keep the essentials rich enough that they fear losing their private rewards more than anything else.
And this calculus of loyalty, it must define the crisis of succession and the role of health in autocracies.
Power in these systems belongs exclusively to the healthy.
Because a dying incumbent can't promise future rewards. And that's the sole basis of the small coalition's loyalty. The incumbency advantage just completely unravels.
We saw this perfectly with the Shah of Iran back in 1979. For years, he ran a brutal, very successful autocracy. But the underlying political crisis that finally allowed millions of protesters to succeed was the army's refusal to stop them.
And why did they refuse?
Because the army's top brass knew the Shah was dying of cancer. A dead Shah could not guarantee future cash flows, future promotions, future villas. They weren't going to risk their lives for a finished product. They just sat on their hands and waited for the inevitable shift.
There was a similar political death knell for Ferdinand Marcos in the Philippines.
He was dying of lupus in the mid-1980s. When he announced snap elections, his key military and political backers deserted him almost overnight. They defected to Corazon Aquino.
Who had zero political experience.
Zero. But she had one critical, overwhelming advantage. She was alive.
So she challenged Marcos at the exact moment his key backers knew he couldn't deliver those future rewards.
It's a purely transactional system. Loyalty ends the second. The key to the treasury is about to change hands.
And this explains why, historically, succession in autocracies is just so incredibly violent. The sources remind us of the Ottoman practice of formalized fratricide.
It was policy. Princes would race to the capital, seize the treasury, and then immediately order all of their brothers to be strangled with a silk cord.
And that logic persists today.
Absolutely. We've seen Stalin execute his relatives. Kim Jong-un ordered the execution of his own influential uncle, Jang Song-taek, and the assassination of his half-brother, Kim Jong-nam. The incoming autocrat must be prepared to kill every potential rival to ensure absolute control over the revenue streams. That is the only thing that buys the essentials loyalty.
This political strategy, this focus on initial private gain to secure power, can even be seen in the earliest political organizations. The sources bring up the story of Pope Damasus I in the 4th century.
It's a fascinating case. Damasus was facing a popular rival, a man named Ursinus, who had the support of the majority of lay Christians and the lower clergy.
So he had the big numbers on his side.
He had the masses. Damasus, however, understood where the true seat of power was. It was with the aristocracy and the Roman emperor, Constantius II,
His winning coalition.
his tiny, essential winning coalition. So he strategically secured power by returning from exile, abandoning the previously exiled predecessor, and throwing his support entirely behind the emperor's favored but temporary antipope.
So he intentionally alienated the masses to secure the loyalty of the small, essential ruling class.
And once he was in power, with the aristocracy loyal to him, he had massive discretionary authority. He had money he didn't have to spend buying the loyalty of the elite anymore.
So what did he do with it?
He used that money for public works, for commissioning lavish churches, and most famously for hiring St. Jerome to write the Vulgate.
Ah, the Latin translation of the Bible. That was accessible to the common person, a public good, strategically deployed.
It was an act that dramatically expanded the Christian laity, shoring up his political power among the very masses whom he had initially ignored. He used private gain aristocratic loyalty to secure his power, and then he used his discretionary funds to deliver a public good, the Vulgate, in his building projects, to consolidate and expand his authority long-term.
It's the perfect model. Small coalition to get power, public goods to keep it.
The small coalition is defined by its focus on private benefits, secrecy, and ruthless transactional loyalty. But when we flip that switch and look at large coalitions, democracies, the political game changes entirely.
Fundamentally, yes, because large coalitions make leaders inherently vulnerable to internal disagreement.
Because they need such a massive number of essentials to stay in power, if a competitor can find an issue, any issue at all, to divide the incumbent supporters, they can immediately seize power.
Which means the entire strategy of coming to power in a democracy revolves around policy and strategy and political division. The sources cite Abraham Lincoln in 1860 as an absolute master of this divisive strategy.
Lincoln understood he was deeply unpopular with the majority of the U.S. electorate at the time. His only path to victory lay in fracturing the incumbent Democratic Party. He didn't focus on uniting his own party, he focused on dividing theirs.
And his primary tool for that was slavery. He forced the Democrat Stephen Douglas into a political corner during their 1858 Senate race, right after the controversial Dred Scott decision.
Lincoln just kept insisting that Douglas clarify his position on whether territories could exclude slavery. Douglas eventually argued that the people of the territory could, in fact, exclude it. It was an answer that won him the Senate seat that day, but it fatally fractured the National Democratic Party.
Because the Southern Democrats couldn't accept that.
They couldn't. So by the 1860 presidential election, the Democrats were split three ways: North, South, and the Constitutional Union Party.
And this division just cleared a path for Lincoln to win the presidency with less than 40% of the popular vote. He got almost no votes in the South.
He achieved what the sources call extreme voter efficiency. He did it by strategically shrinking the effective coalition he needed to win the Electoral College.
This constant vulnerability means Democratic leaders have to engage in a ceaseless policy arms race.
They have to. They must constantly propose popular, responsive policies to satisfy that massive winning coalition, even if those policies are economically damaging down the road. This is the structural reason why Democratic leaders are so often accused of mortgaging our children's future.
They have to satisfy the coalition now to stay in power.
The future is someone else's problem. And this explains what happened to Winston Churchill in 1945. You lead the nation to victory in the most catastrophic war in human history, and you are immediately rejected by the voters.
It seems so ungrateful.
It's not about gratitude. Churchill, despite his magnificent wartime leadership, was soundly defeated by Clement Attlee's Labour Party, even before the war in the Pacific was officially over.
And why? What was the policy difference?
Churchill offered continued austerity and a return to imperial greatness. Attlee offered the National Health Service, a welfare state, and housing reform.
Attlee won the battle for good ideas.
He won the battles for good policy. The sources argue this just proves that democracy is fundamentally about delivering policy results to the large coalition. It's not about gratitude for past service. The coalition votes for the future public good they will receive, not the past loyalty they showed.
And this robust need for popular policies is precisely what makes democracy so incredibly difficult to undo once it's really established.
Attempts to shrink the U.S. coalition, like some of the things we saw post-2020 election, face tremendous hurdles precisely because the coalition is so massive. It's operating above that zero point 0.9 scale we mentioned.
Why does that high number create such an institutional immunity against internal authoritarianism?
Because once a government is sufficiently democratic, the welfare of the essential coalition can only decrease if the system shifts to a small coalition. It's just a mathematical certainty.
Explain that a bit more.
Well, the millions of people who benefit from robust public goods, Social Security, Medicare, environmental protections, guaranteed freedoms, they would all overwhelmingly oppose a shift to a tiny autocratic coalition, because that would inevitably mean higher taxation on the masses, reduced freedoms, and a massive decline in public welfare for the many in favor of private rewards for the few.
The leader of a large coalition simply cannot afford to deliver private rewards to a select few. They have to deliver public goods to the many.
And this logic governs the entire difference in accountability. In a democracy, protest is cheap. It's easy, it's coordinated, because you have freedom of assembly and a free press.
So poor performance, like the government failures after Hurricane Katrina in 2005, leads to political consequences. Heads roll, you lose the next election.
But in autocracies, the cost of protest is incredibly high, and citizens know the leader has the financial resources to pay the small coalition to oppress them.
So dissatisfaction from the masses only succeeds under very specific circumstances.
It only succeeds if the ruling coalition itself is underpaid or compromised, and they refuse to suppress the populace. This is the critical mechanism of authoritarian failure.
It's the army refusing to fight for a dying leader, like the Shah.
Or an underpaying one, like Mubarak in Egypt, who was facing economic crises and aid cuts. The revolution is only smoothed when the essential supporters decide they're better off looking for a new leader who can pay them better.
So the ultimate takeaway here is that the function of government, how it taxes, how it distributes wealth, is entirely different depending on coalition size. And this explains some of the most enduring economic mysteries in the world.
This is where the calculus gets truly cold.
Right.
In small coalition regimes, leaders tax heavily, but they redistribute that wealth ruthlessly from the poor and disenfranchised, the interchangeables, to the rich coalition members, the essentials.
Which is why autocracies, despite having vast populations living in poverty, can often have very high per capita incomes for the essential few.
Exactly. And that seems entirely counterintuitive when we look at progressive democracies, like in Scandinavia or Western Europe, which have these massive headline income tax rates.
That seems backwards.
That's because the comparison is misleading. Those progressive systems tax the high-income earners very heavily to pay for public goods that benefit the entire large coalition. But if we look at taxation at lower, more typical income levels, the masses, the system is completely flipped.
Give us a hard comparison.
Okay, take a single U.S. family with one child earning, let's say, $32,400. That family, after all the credits and deductions, generally pays no income tax. They might even receive money back from the government through welfare transfers.
Okay.
Now, take a family in a small coalition state like China, earning the exact same amount. The sources show that that family is expected to pay around $6,725 in income tax.
Wow. So the masses in an autocracy are fundamentally taxed higher than the masses in a democracy, even if the total tax revenue collected by the government is smaller.
Yes. The tax system is a wealth extractor. It targets the interchangeables to fund the private rewards of the essentials. And this also means it is incredibly unwise to become rich in an autocracy, unless the government made you rich and you remain unequivocally loyal.
Because if your loyalty falters for even a second, your wealth instantly becomes an implicit tax target.
Precisely. Look at Mikhail Khodorkovsky in Russia. He was the country's richest man, and he dared to fund opposition parties. He ended up spending years in prison on trumped-up fraud charges. The government literally accused his company, Yukos, of tax evasion that sometimes exceeded its gross revenue just to drive it into bankruptcy so they could seize the assets.
Or a more recent example might be Jack Ma in China.
A perfect example. Jack Ma, after speaking out critically about the state regulatory system, saw the $37 billion IPO of his Ant Group suspended overnight. His business interests were severely curtailed. He learned the lesson very quickly. If you are wealthy outside the direct patronage of the government and you aren't absolutely loyal, the leader will take your wealth instantly, because that's revenue that could be better spent on his essentials.
What's really fascinating here is that the inefficiency we call corruption is often not a failure of the small coalition system. It's actually an essential political tool for survival.
It's politically rational corruption. Leaders license it because it avoids the administrative hassle and the visibility of organized taxation and transfer.
So instead of having a public accounting of how much money they are paying their
They
cronies.
simply allow them to extract bribes directly. Saddam Hussein's sons, for instance, were allowed to make an absolute fortune smuggling oil during the UN sanctions in the 1990s. The leader ensures loyalty by giving his cronies the right to steal directly from the state's resources.
And this brings us right back to the resource curse. If you're an autocrat, having oil or diamonds or minerals is the ultimate political dream.
It's a dream because these resources generate massive revenue streams that do not require freedoms or an educated population or a productive citizenry to be extracted. They are a leader's dream and a people's nightmare.
They allow the leader to just completely ignore the vast majority of the population.
Exactly. Resource-rich nations are consistently more oppressive and less likely to democratize. Look at Angola. Luanda, its capital, was consistently ranked as one of the most expensive cities in the world for foreign workers. That indicates massive wealth circulating among the elite.
Yet the vast majority of the local population lives below the poverty line.
The government has access to all that oil wealth, so it has zero incentive to empower the people or develop a broader economy that would require public goods like education or healthcare.
And even when autocrats do provide what look like public goods like building a road, they often serve as intentional political tools designed for graft.
The sources suggest that shoddy infrastructure, like crooked roads leading from a capital city to an airport, is often a deliberate design feature.
How is that a feature?
It's the cold genius of the small coalition. Roads are immensely costly, which makes them perfect avenues for graft and kickbacks. But building a country that is too well connected, too fast, or too efficient can lead to the rise of new, independent regional power centers.
Like strong regional governors or economic hubs that could threaten the central autocrat.
Right. So shoddy indirect infrastructure ensures that graft is easy, while simultaneously preventing the kind of coordination and power consolidation that threatens the regime.
And how does this brutal logic apply to supposedly universal public goods like education and healthcare?
The sources are very clear on this. Autocrats provide just enough basic education literacy, fundamental labor skills to maintain the core functioning of the economy. But they severely limit broad educational opportunity because highly educated people are inherently a threat to their survival.
Because educated citizens are better able to coordinate protests and understand the mechanics of corruption.
So if the autocrat wants his own children to succeed, he sends them to Oxford or Harvard. But he keeps his populace functionally literate but politically ignorant.
And in terms of public health?
The calculation is particularly cold. The sources suggest that saving babies, for example, does not help autocrats survive in power.
That sounds shocking. Can you unpack that brutal logic a little more?
Certainly. The data shows that infant mortality rates are significantly lower in democratic countries, and that's independent of the overall national income.
So it's not just that they're richer.
No. In autocracies, improving public health infrastructure like clean water or vaccination programs requires spending money on the masses, who are the interchangeables. That money, from the leader's perspective, could be much better spent on a private reward for an essential general.
So from a purely strategic standpoint, spending money to save lives is an inefficient political move for a dictator.
It is entirely inefficient. During the sanctions on Iraq, Saddam Hussein allowed his cronies to steal UN-provided baby formula and medicine. This led to a massive doubling of the infant mortality rate, all while he was simultaneously spending hundreds of millions of dollars building lavish palaces for himself and his essentials.
The political calculus is clear. Building palaces buys the loyalty of the essentials and ensures security. Saving children does not.
This self-interested logic doesn't stop at the border. It fundamentally dictates how nations interact, particularly when it comes to things like foreign aid and war.
When we talk about international politics, we really have to jettison the pleasant but false idea that foreign aid is primarily about alleviating poverty.
The source material argues that foreign aid is fundamentally a tool. It's given by democracies who have to deliver policy results to their large coalition to autocracies in exchange for specific desired policy concessions. In short, it is a bribe.
So the U.S. pays countries like Egypt or Pakistan for favors, things like security concessions, maintaining peace with Israel, or allowing troop movements through their airspace.
And the cost of that compliance, the price of that bribe, is entirely dependent on the size of the recipient leader's coalition. Autocracies are inherently cheap to buy because the policy concession only needs to be sold to a small group of essentials.
This explains why Egypt's recognition of Israel was only possible after President Sadat extracted massive amounts of U.S. military and financial aid.
Exactly. That aid compensated his small ruling coalition for adopting a policy peace with Israel that was highly unpopular among the vast Egyptian populace. And critically, maintaining that anti-Israel sentiment among the populace is actually politically advantageous for the Egyptian autocrat,
How so?
because it allows them to continue extracting aid from the U.S. at a very high price.
This dynamic is why, paradoxically, foreign aid often results in anti-U.S. sentiment in the countries that receive it.
The people on the ground correctly perceive that the aid props up the oppressive regimes that tax them so heavily.
We see this consistently in places like Pakistan and Egypt, where despite receiving billions in assistance, favorable views of the U.S. are consistently extremely low.
The leaders take the money, pay their generals, and then allow the populace to hate the donor country. It works perfectly for their political survival.
Conversely, trying to buy policy from a democracy must be incredibly expensive.
It's often prohibitively expensive. The U.S. failed, for instance, to buy Turkey's cooperation for the Iraq invasion back in 2003. The U.S. offered a substantial package of loans and aid, but the policy allowing U.S. troops to stage in Turkey was massively unpopular with the large Turkish coalition.
So the value of the U.S. offer, even though it was large, was rejected.
It was rejected because accepting it would have cost the democratic Turkish leadership far too much in domestic support. They would have lost the next election.
And this same logic applies to war. War is simply a continuation of domestic politics by other means, and the strategy you use depends entirely on your coalition size.
Autocrats, following a sort of Sun Tzu logic, fight casually. They'll go to war for land or slaves or treasure. But their overriding priority is the loyalty of their small coalition over victory itself. They must prioritize the distribution of private rewards.
The sources use the 1967 Six-Day War as a stark illustration of this difference.
Conventional military analysis has always struggled to explain why the massive Soviet-equipped Egyptian army lost so quickly to tiny Israel. But through the coalition lens, it's perfectly clear.
The Israeli coalition was huge.
Right, and to fund that war effort, each essential Israeli coalition member was asked to sacrifice only about $60 in potential private reward. For them, victory, a public good, was worth far more than that small financial cost.
But the incentives for the Egyptian Essential Coalition, the 1,000 or so key military officers and senior civil servants, were completely different.
Those Egyptian essentials stood to receive immense private rewards, estimated at around $150,000 each from the military budget, if those funds weren't actually spent on the war effort.
So President Nasser would have risked being overthrown in a military coup if he had tried to strip $150,000 per person from his cronies to spend on winning a long, costly war.
They would rather keep the cash than risk a protracted fight. So the autocrat fights until the cost of continued fighting starts to impinge on the loyalty payments for his essentials, and then he quits.
Democrats, on the other hand, following a sort of Weinberger-Powell logic, only fight when victory is nearly certain and when the objective serves the national interest, a clear public good.
And crucially, if the fight gets tough, they increase their effort. They do troop surges, like in Iraq and Afghanistan. Autocrats, once the initial cheap effort proves insufficient, tend to quit rather than use up treasure that's better spent on their cronies.
And finally, this logic defines international intervention strategy. We often hear the rhetoric that the U.S. wants to spread democracy, but the sources argue that, strategically, democratic leaders prefer compliant foreign autocrats.
Absolutely. Democratic leaders prefer compliant foreign autocrats, puppets, because autocrats are inherently easier and cheaper to influence and control than a foreign democrat, who has to answer to his own large, expensive coalition.
The sources say U.S. foreign policy is awash with examples of covertly undermining democracy.
Indeed. We saw this in the replacement of the Congo's democratically elected leader Patrice Lumumba with a puppet leader. It is always cheaper and easier to buy the obedience of one man and his small band of loyalists with private rewards than it is to buy the compliance of millions of constituents in a foreign democracy with expensive public goods.
So we have these ironclad rules of political survival. The system dictates the leader's behavior, not the leader's morals. The question then becomes, can we, the public, ever change the game? Can we fix the system?
Reform, which fundamentally means successfully expanding the winning coalition, is possible. But the sources argue it is highly dependent on timing. It is most likely to succeed when the coalition members themselves fear being purged or ousted.
And that seems to happen at two critical points. when a leader has just come to power or when that leader is dying or clearly finished.
When a leader first comes to power, the new essentials are unsure who will survive the inevitable purges. So they are vulnerable to proposals that might stabilize the system long term. Jerry John Rawlings in Ghana is a classic example. After he seized power in 1982, he was desperately short on revenue. The only way he could get money from international financial institutions was to introduce radical economic and democratic reforms.
He wasn't doing it to enrich the people, though. He was doing it to stabilize the state revenue he needed to survive.
Correct. He survived by staying one step ahead of the populace, granting concessions that gradually expanded the coalition while they were still too disorganized to overthrow him entirely. He used reform as a survival mechanism.
And the end of a long reign is equally destabilizing. Corazon Aquino succeeded because Marcos was dying. Ben Ali in Tunisia fled into exile during the Arab Spring when his questionable health heightened the risk of coalition turnover.
And that opened the window for genuine democratization and a real reduction in corruption.
The sources emphasize that this logic applies universally, not just to political regimes, but to corporate governance and even nonprofits. Organizations often function as tyrannical regimes.
Let's apply that to corporate governance. If the CEO and the board operate as a small coalition, they provide lavish private rewards, bonuses, perks, golden parachutes to the essentials, instead of providing public goods like high dividends or sustained stock value for the massive shareholders.
And the research shows that putting more outsiders on a corporate board, which effectively expands the coalition, translates directly into better returns for shareholders, a public good.
But it simultaneously translates into greater risk for the CEO. So naturally, CEOs fight tooth and nail to keep outsiders or anyone who might challenge that private reward mechanism off the board.
The ultimate counterexample to this is the Green Bay Packers, the only nonprofit community-owned NFL team. They have over 361,000 shareholders, a massive coalition.
Their ownership rules explicitly preclude any small clique from taking control. And while they don't maximize revenue in the sense of paying dividends, because they're nonprofit, they demonstrate phenomenal fan loyalty and success. They focus heavily on public goods, like winning games, building a great fan experience, and maintaining stability.
It proves that a public goods focus is entirely compatible with a large coalition structure, unlike every other NFL team, which, by league rules, has to be owned by a small group.
So if the goal is better governance, whether it's corporate or national, the path is clear. You have to change the incentives by making the coalition larger.
And this requires fixing the structural mechanisms that allow politicians to control the electorate. One key mechanism cited in the sources is gerrymandering.
Redrawing electoral boundaries to exclude opposition voters.
Exactly. The sources make the stunning observation that the odds of an incumbent being voted out of a U.S. congressional seat in a heavily gerrymandered district are statistically similar to the odds faced by members of the Supreme Soviet under the old communist regime.
Gerrymandering shrinks the effective essential coalition size for incumbents. It allows them to focus on pleasing only a tiny, predetermined slice of the electorate rather than the wider public.
And another, perhaps less obvious, method of expanding the coalition is increasing access to citizenship and immigration.
Historically, easy access to citizenship and immigration has expanded the coalition in the U.S. When more people can vote and join the Selectorate, it increases the pressure on the government to produce more public goods like roads, schools, and infrastructure that benefit the wider community.
So giving amnesty or easy access to citizenship, then, is a mechanism for selectively choosing those who demonstrate an ability to work and pay taxes. You're essentially converting a massive interchangeables into an essential voting bloc that demands public bids.
It's about turning the huddled masses into the foundation of a stronger, more prosperous society by changing the incentives for the incumbent. If you want a government that delivers public goods, you need a large, demanding coalition.
We've seen that these iron rules of political survival dictate leader behavior, and those rules seem to be unchangeable. But we, the citizens, can choose to change the size and the structure of the coalition, which in turn changes the incentives.
Absolutely. And here's the final provocative thought. The sworn duty of democratic leaders is to do precisely what we, the people, want. So if we complain bitterly about foreign aid propping up dictators, which we know it does in exchange for policy concessions, yet we still demand cheap oil or quick security concessions, we should recognize that we are supplying the demand for the policies that require that autocratic compromise.
So we're part of the problem.
We must understand the rules to play the game of politics better, and perhaps, just perhaps, choose to stop demanding policies that are inherently structurally immoral.
Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this deep dive, please give us a good rating and subscribe to our channel. See you next time.